Welcome to our, I think it's the 17th CRWDP webinar. How the presentation will run today is that I will introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Dana Howse, and then Dana will give her presentation, and at the end we'll have a Q&A. So Dr. Dana Howse was a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy from 2017 to 2019. She was co-located between the Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research at Memorial University and the Canada Research Chair in Occupational Health and Safety, Law, Faculty of Law, Civil Law at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Howse completed her PhD in Public Health Science in the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, where she studied injured workers' experiences with problematic compensation claims. She recently took up a research position with the Primary Healthcare Unit in the Faculty of Medicine at Memorial University, where she is working on a number of studies that are examining ways to improve the management of social needs within the primary care setting. Dr. Howse is going to be presenting on her postdoctoral research. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dana.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dan, and thank you everyone who's on the line here for taking time today to attend this webinar. As Dan noted, I'm presenting on the research I did as a postdoctoral fellow with CRWDP, and I did that work from 2017 to 2019. And as Dan also mentioned, I've been in a new role now since January, which has sort of taken me away from this work to some extent, so it's been really nice to return to it. And I'm keen to present some of my findings today and to hear from some of you who are currently immersed in this research and in this area and thinking about some of these issues, particularly in a time that is quite different from the time when I did this research. So I will start with an outline of my study. So basically, I'll just take a few moments off the top to provide a little bit of background and rationale for the study. And then I just want to take a short moment to explain some of the key concepts that I use, just to clarify how I think about them and how I define some of these key concepts. And then I'll take you through the two phases of this postdoctoral research I'm presenting today. So I will describe the methods and then review some of the key findings from phase 1, which was a scoping review of relevant literature. And then phase 2, which was a qualitative study involving document analysis and some interviews. And then finally, I will end with some concluding thoughts. So the goal of this study broadly is to expand our understanding or develop our understanding of how we can improve the labor engagement of people with disabilities. So work disability is recognized as a worldwide public health problem. And the number of under and unemployed people with disabilities is growing, and as are the related social and economic consequences for people with disabilities and for society more broadly. And here in Canada, we know from available research and from the most recent Canadian Survey on Disability, which was done in 2017, that people with disabilities are more likely to be living in poverty and less likely to be employed than those without disabilities. And those people with disabilities who are employed are more likely to work part-time, they're more likely to earn significantly less than Canadians without disabilities. Moreover, the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability determined that about 40% of working-age Canadians with disabilities who are unemployed had potential to work. So what this means is these are people who, when they completed this survey, they said they would be looking for work within the following 12 months. So they were therefore not retired, nor were they entirely prevented from working due to the limitations of their disability. So according to this report then, that's almost 645,000 Canadians with disabilities who could be working with accommodations or under more inclusive conditions, but who are currently unemployed. So in addition to some of these financial impacts of unemployment and underemployment for Canadians with disabilities, the work and health literature also links underemployment or unemployment with a higher likelihood of mental illness, due, for example, to financial hardship. They link it also with a lack of social support and a perceived loss of control. There's a wealth of literature as well that documents similar consequences for work absence related to work injury or illness in particular. And some of those consequences include worsening physical and mental health, strained and damaged relationships, chronic disability, financial hardship, and poverty. Conversely, the same work and health literature suggests that the engagement of injured workers and people with disabilities in work promotes recovery, rehabilitation, and improved health outcomes. It can lower the risk of long-term incapacity, and it can limit related physical, mental, and social consequences. And finally, labor force engagement can also promote participation in society and just generally improves well-being. There are significant financial consequences of under and unemployment of persons with disability at the societal level as well. And estimates suggest that the total annual income support for unemployed Canadians with disabilities is around $30 billion. And this estimate is expected to grow with increasing rates of mental illness, aging populations, and with more youth with disabilities transitioning away from their dependence on their families. So it's no surprise then that a significant amount of policy and research efforts are dedicated to improving the labor engagement of persons with disabilities. And this includes some of the excellent work that's been coming out of CRWDP over the last many years. But an important area of work disability prevention and management that has seen relatively little attention relates to the ability of workers with physical disabilities to travel to, from, and within work. This work-related travel, or what I will refer to often as work mobility, can address employment issues by expanding the potential labor force for employers and by providing greater job opportunities for workers. But work-related travel is becoming increasingly challenging and complex with the growth in precarious employment and with the expansion of transportation and construction sectors, as well as other highly mobile sectors, such as the home care sector. And a growing body of literature on work mobility, a lot of which is coming out of the On the Move partnership, is identifying a vast array of challenges associated with mobility, which includes significant physical and mental strain on workers and their families as they navigate these complex trips to work. And some of these challenges may be especially problematic for or exclude work-disabled individuals who have physical disabilities. And while work mobility is an integral part of accessing, carrying out, and sustaining a job, work mobility research has shown, and as I will argue here today, that work disability research and policy largely takes for granted the accomplishment of work mobility. And it overlooks the related complex processes and features of getting to work that can pose unique challenges for people with disabilities. So my research then seeks to identify the ways work disability policies and programs influence, either positively or negatively, the ability of people with disabilities to engage in work mobility. But before I go on, I just want to clarify how I think about or define some of the key concepts I'm using here. So in my research, I conceive of work mobility as the physical movement to, from, and within one's job. And I differentiate this form of mobility from other sorts of mobility, such as social mobility or economic mobility. I conceive of work mobility as occurring on its spectrum, ranging from fairly minimal mobility, as with home-based work, to local and extended daily commutes, but also to longer intra-provincial or territorial or cross-country travel, as well as mobility within the course of work. This conception of mobility also considers the various touch points encountered throughout one's journey, including on public transportation, the broader built environment, and so on. I focus this work on persons with physical disabilities, disabilities which limit their mobility either directly due to concrete physical limitations or indirectly due to limitations associated with required treatments, such as medications and therapies. I include in my conception of physical disabilities both work-related and non-work-related disabilities, and those that are continuous, intermittent, or episodic. And finally, I note that my research is framed by the social model of disability, which conceives it not as a personal or biological attribute of the individual, but rather as the situational outcome of the interaction between an individual with body or functional differences and a specific physical or social environment. So this brings me to phase one of my research, which was a scoping review. So as Dan mentioned in my bio off the top, my previous research has focused more on injured workers and on the workers' compensation system. So my first step when I took up this work was to start with a review of the relevant literature in order to generate an inventory of the issues related to work mobility and work disability policy, and to really get a sense for the coverage of the literature in this area. So using methods of scoping review and the expert assistance of Kristen Rahm, a health sciences librarian at Memorial University, this step involved a literature search of 4 databases of international literature to find relevant English language sources from the time frame of 1997 to early 2018. And I conducted this search using 5 key concepts, as well as some related synonyms, that would really establish this intersection of the literatures I was looking at. So these key concepts were physical disability, accessibility, mobility, work, and policy. And so this search yielded 60 relevant sources. I'm just going to take a real quick moment to give you a glimpse of what some of those sources look like, what this sort of spread of the literature looks like. So you can see here that generally more research is being carried out over time. So, most of the articles, about 50 of the 60, have been published since 2008 through till 2018. And the vast majority of the research was from the US and Canada. And then concerning the breakdown of disability type, most of the studies talked about physical disabilities in the general sense, without specifying a particular type or particular features. There were some exceptions, including 4 that focused on users of mobility devices or assistive technology, and 3 others that examined issues related to visual impairment, and then 4 others which looked at a specific condition. So I've listed those here. So hearing impairment, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, and spinal cord injury. Interestingly, although the articles largely did not specify the type of disability, most acknowledged the diverse, unique needs of persons with disabilities that necessitate individualized approaches to labor engagement. And I just show you here a breakdown of the 60 sources by the policy, program, or issue. And for the sake of this presentation, I'll focus on the 2 topics that were covered by the highest number of articles. So a topic that received significant attention in the review was factors affecting work participation of persons with disabilities. And these sources considered a wide range of social, educational, health, and environmental factors. So these studies suggest that people with disabilities who are more likely to be employed are those who have a higher education, have less severe disabilities, and who tend to work in more professional occupations. So occupations, for example, where there would be less physical labor and mobility. But that only seems to hold up to a point where in more professional occupations, promotions may come along that then require increased travel. And those types of things may function to exclude persons with disabilities. Factors that have been found to help people with disabilities engage in work include strong self-advocacy and resilience. And this includes a number of things. So the worker's understanding of benefits and supports available to them and their eligibility for those supports, and how those supports are affected once earning an income. Other factors are job-specific training, networking supports, and effective workplace accommodations. On the other hand, factors that came up time and again as roadblocks to employment include transportation-related challenges, difficulties with workplace accommodations, and stigma and assumptions about what people with disabilities can and cannot do in the workplace, as well as employer fears about the costs associated with accommodation. Now, I've just sort of captured here in bold font some of these factors that are particularly relevant to the issues that I'm looking at: work mobility, work-related travel and transportation for people with physical disabilities. The largest number of studies in this review focused on workplace accommodations, so adaptations in the work environment that enable workers with disabilities to do their jobs productively and to have equal opportunity for advancement. These studies presented predictors of workplace accommodations being granted and the process for initiating and carrying out accommodations. And several of these sources examined accommodations of particular relevance to work mobility, such as work scheduling to accommodate unreliable or poorly timed transportation, work from home and telework to eliminate transportation issues altogether, and supported commutes. But on the whole, these articles focused on accommodations that address barriers inside the workplace. That was the large focus of these sources. They focused on barriers inside the workplace rather than those outside the workplace that might help workers get to work and between work sites. And these studies suggest that when requested, transportation-related accommodations are the least likely to be granted, and they seem to meet the most resistance in court. Commute-related issues are generally considered to be a personal responsibility, and interventions outside the workplace are argued to be inherently unreasonable and are seen to easily qualify as undue hardship for employers, thus releasing employers from their duty to accommodate. One source within this review called for a rethinking of reasonable accommodation and undue hardship so that we may conceive accommodations related to transportation as reasonable because they enable persons with disabilities to get to work. And after all, getting to work is an essential function of the job. So while work mobility was not explicitly studied in these articles, a number of the studies did produce relevant findings, such as those including the role and boundaries of employing a personal assistant in the workplace, the utility of work scheduling or work from home arrangements to address transportation issues, accessible parking spaces, and the feasibility of supported commutes. So key takeaways for me from this scoping review were that there's generally little existing research examining the work mobility, examining that in an explicit way, work mobility and work-related travel for people with disabilities. Much of the research in this area has focused on workplace accommodations and largely frames those in terms of barriers inside the workplace that might be addressed. Barriers outside the workplace, such as transportation-related issues, are framed as a matter of personal responsibility, and they're widely conceived as inherently unreasonable and constituting undue burden for the employer. So this brings me then to phase 2 of my postdoctoral work, which was a qualitative study. And this qualitative study was theoretically informed by a structural interactionist perspective. So that means that I conceive individual experiences as well as policy and practice related to work disability as socially produced through local level interactions and framed by broader social and institutional structures, such as broader policies and shared ways of thinking. The second phase of my work employed methods of critical, interpretive, qualitative inquiry and classic legal analysis. Specifically, it involved 12 interviews, 5 with people with disabilities, and 6 with key informants who have experience with developing, implementing, or accessing the work disability policies and supports. It also involved document analysis of relevant human rights and workers' compensation legislation, policy, and case law in Newfoundland and Labrador and Ontario. So for this work, I moved between the interviews and interview data and document analysis to identify issues and to examine them, along with policies and practices that shape the work mobility of injured workers and people with non-work-related disabilities. Data analysis was iterative and interpretive. I employed multiple analytical techniques, including multiple layered readings of interview transcripts and of the various documents, inductive and deductive coding, constant comparison, and discourse analysis. So analysis of my interview data and my key policy documents suggests that work-related travel, even for those with physical disabilities, is often taken for granted and doesn't seem to be adequately accounted for in the policies and practices for both injured workers and for people with non-work-related disabilities. So first, in terms of injured workers, workers' compensation and workers' compensation policy and practice, the system's apparent disregard for the impacts of work-related travel can be seen in two ways. First, it can be seen in a lack of support for transportation to work through the return to work process. And secondly, it can be seen through the new or amplified travel-related challenges that the return to work process can pose or introduce. So in terms of the lack of support for transportation to work, in both provinces, in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Ontario, the system will generally cover the costs of transportation to medical and assessment appointments and to rehabilitation during the early and safe return to work process when the plan is to get the worker back to their pre-injury employer. That's generally speaking. It's not always the case, and sometimes that transportation support may only be offered in extraordinary cases. And should the early and safe return to work process not be successful, the compensation board may cover transportation to retraining. But again, that's providing the worker and the retraining arrangement meets certain criteria. So in both provinces, it requires that the travel to this retraining location is a certain distance from home. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, it has to be more than 50 kilometers from home. But this is where the transportation-related support seems to stop. So the workers' compensation systems don't seem to recognize the cost or effort associated with an injured worker's trip to work. And it doesn't seem to view this transportation to work as something to be managed by the system. So this key informant here explains how she sees the workers' compensation's role or understanding of its transportation-related supports. So I asked, what transportation supports are provided under workers' compensation to support return to work? And she says very little. The board, like the end of the work transition plan and then the deeming, the board sees itself as out of it. Any kind of accommodations around transportation or even like modifications to the workplace that are needed to support somebody's mobility needs, that's really the employer's responsibility and the employer's duty to accommodate. Where the board sees their responsibility is ensuring that the worker can make it to the work transition program. Say there's somebody in the north living in a little town and they have actually got a community college program, but it's 2 hours away. They can't commute every day. The board will pay for their accommodation and transportation expenses while they're attending that program. But once that program is over, the board is out of there. So again, it's this echoes what I heard from a number of key informants and injured workers, was that there are some transportation-related supports during the return to work process, during retraining and reassessment and rehabilitation. But once they begin going back on, easing back to work, that's where the transportation support stops. And similarly, this key informant notes that the board's role in transportation supports is really focused around what it sees as compensable. And he says, but the accommodations and the difficulty and the fatigue that may be occurring during transportation is completely ignored, because that's not really compensable. So the workers' compensation mindset is what is compensable, and what is compensable is the hours at work. That's the only comparator. But in terms of real working ability, in terms of a holistic point of view, the transportation to work is part of your daily fatigue. That's not considered at all, but it should be. And then finally, this key informant reflects on, again, how there is an oversight of the costs and the efforts that can go into the injured worker's trip to work, and all that goes into accomplishing that work mobility. And they note, they give the example of single parents, and they say they have multiple drop-offs, that the board doesn't consider. I think they forget sometimes that the injured worker is injured. To get everybody packed up and get them out of the house and to make that first stop, they are wore out, right? And one of these key informants as well notes that there's an additional consequence to the way the workers' compensation system supports transportation and the way it supports some transportation costs, but not others. And they note that travel, for example, to an assessment appointment at which a worker's degree of disability is determined may very well be arranged and paid for by the Workers' Compensation Board. So the worker might get a taxi to the appointment, and at that appointment, they might be assessed at, let's say, 30% disabled. But then when they return to work and they have to get there on their own, possibly on public transit, that might require a lot of walking, waiting periods, long periods of standing or sitting, all of which is made more difficult by their injury. The resulting fatigue and pain associated with that self-managed trip to work hadn't been accounted for in that assessment when their trip was paid for and easier. So now they're at work, they're more fatigued, they're more disabled than they were when they went to the assessment appointment. So if travel and its effects are not accounted for, workers may be expected to work longer and harder, and they may be expected to take more complicated and longer trips to work than they are able given their disability or their work-related injury. Another way that the workers' compensation system appears to overlook travel-related challenges is the way it can introduce or amplify travel challenges through the return to work process. And it can do this, for example, by arranging modified work that requires extended travel, or again, assigning work arrangements that conflict with the person's existing transportation options. A key informant told me about a woman who lived in a rural area and she was injured on her job and unable to find other suitable work where she lived. So the modified work she was offered was a fly-in, fly-out scenario with a 3-week on, 3-week off arrangement. This was offered to her and it was considered acceptable. This worker here explains that he was sent to a different work location as part of his work accommodation, which was 2 hours from his original job. And his employer suggested that he carpool with others driving to the new location. But he notes, like, I was pretty stranded. I could get a ride there and then be told that I'd have to wait 8 hours to come home, but I'm only supposed to do 2 hours work. And finally, this quote from another key informant really captures some of the transportation-related challenges that arise through the return to work process. And they note, it's hard to put numbers on this stuff, but it's very frequent that transportation is the main barrier to return to work. Because both workers, the employer will ask them to go back to a place farther, the other workstation is farther away, but also workers aren't able to use the means they used to use to get to work, or there's a new shift required or something, right? So they no longer, their son won't take them to work anymore, or they can't take the bus with the injury because they have to do this and they can't do that, and they don't want to ask for a seat. And the board's response is, that's not our fault. If you can do this, you should be able to take the bus. There's no reason. So transportation is huge. Another way the return to work process can introduce extended travel or travel-related challenges is through the deeming process. And many of us on this call, I think, will be familiar with the notion of deeming. This is when the compensation board determines that an injured worker has reached maximum recovery and is able to work and is employable in a designated kind of job that the board has determined is suitable and available. So this could be work in customer service, for example, or according to the key informant's parking lot attendant is a very common deemed job. And deeming practices assert that the worker is employable within their, quote, labor market. And so this could be a large region across which they are expected to travel and take up the available work. So in the case of Toronto, for example, the labor market is typically considered to be the GTA. So that could mean a 2-hour trip on public transportation in order for the worker to take up this work that the board has identified as suitable and available. And so here's a quote from a person with a disability who's reflecting on having been deemed in a job. And she notes, they deem me to a job I do not have. You know, they base their calculations based on work that I haven't and will not have, which is ridiculous. There's no way I can work a 40-hour week job. I know it, right? I have to be careful not to crash. So she's reflecting here on her inability to work 40 hours a week, but also on the travel she would have to undertake to get to that work every day. And here's a quote from a key informant reflecting again on the labor market and how that can introduce extended travel for some injured workers who are deemed employable. So I ask, in terms of deeming, are there limits around the length of a commute a worker would be expected to take on? And the key informant notes, at the tribunal, there certainly is, but it's ill-defined. If there's a big center, and if it's like a job like customer service rep, which is such a broad category, the tribunal would also say, well, I'm sure there's customer service rep jobs closer to your home in a city the size of Toronto. You don't have to go from your corner to down here. You can just go here, and that would be an hour's commute, and that's normal for a Toronto commute. And the key informant notes that the board, the Workers' Compensation Board, looks at commuting patterns prior to the injury to sort of assess what's normal. So if you were commuting an hour or two prior to your injury, they would say you're used to that and that's normal for you. But again, this doesn't account for the disability that the worker now has on account of their work-related injury and all of the effort and fatigue that goes along with taking this trip to work. My analysis also determined that work disability policy and supports also does not adequately account for travel-related challenges for persons with non-work-related disabilities as well. And I can see this in terms of a couple of the supports and programs that are available for persons with disabilities, including accessible transit, as well as the community supports that are available to people with disabilities. And so accessible transit may often be available, but it can come with restrictions and challenges that can compromise its utility as a reliable form of transportation for work. So it was noted, for example, that there can be variation in the availability of accessible transit. So depending on where one lives, it may not be available at all. So this person with a disability noted that in their hometown, there was no accessible taxi. So when they were living at home, my mom and I were getting very frustrated with each other because she didn't want to bring me everywhere and I didn't want to stay home. So I'd be like, Mom, I need to go to a job interview or something. This person with a disability also notes that they were offered a job in a nearby community, but because the available accessible bus did not go there, they had to decline the job because they could not afford a taxi to and from that work. Similarly, the accessible transit supports available for people with disabilities have some restrictions related to scheduling requirements, inflexibility, and unreliability that again make it compromise its utility as a reliable source of transportation for work. And here are some quotes to illustrate some of these challenges. So in regards to scheduling requirements, this person with a disability notes that cancellation notice used to have to be 90 minutes, but now it's 45. But once you call to book it, I suppose you have to go on it. That's the problem with it. You make the booking and then you're forced to go because you don't have the energy to cancel. You're always having to be planning. Like I have to be looking in my fridge and figuring out when I'm going to run out of milk. And again, in relation to work-related travel, they note that snow days can be extremely complicated. And they note snow days are the worst. If you get a snow day, I'm texting my boss, like, can you tell me if it's a snow day? Because I have 45 minutes to tell someone to call the accessible bus and cancel. People with disabilities also mention the amount of time and waiting associated with using accessible transit. And so this person with disability notes that when I met with them, they had the bus booked for 8:30, but it didn't come till 9 o'clock. And while it's often reliable, sometimes they're terribly slow. And she gave an example, like I had my therapy appointment at 2:30, and I didn't get in till 4:05. And my pickup was for 4:30. When the doctor finished, he's like, "Any questions?" And I said, "No, I really have to go," and I ran out. And it ended up the bus was running an hour behind. An additional way in which the supports and programs available to people with disabilities don't help with transportation or create transportation-related challenges is that they are means tested. And so the threat of losing supports can impede the labor engagement of people with disabilities. And so this person with disability notes, "I only took the receptionist job because I thought it would be a good entry-level job. But the problem with those jobs is they really, anything else comes from them that you can move out of. Like you could be there forever because you already have everything worked out. And when you get that job, that impacts your finances, which impacts your supports. I had a job interview and it was for 6 months for half of $50,000. But where I was living at the time, they said, if you make more than $33,000 annually, you have to move out. And I was like, move out for a 6-month job? That's a bit stressful. And in the second quote, the person with disability notes that they had a work term where they made $18 an hour for 13 weeks, and they lost all of their supports, including repairs for their walker, their wheelchair, and the support they had of someone coming to their home to clean and get their laundry done. So basically, the work disabilities and policies and practice for both injured workers and persons with disability do not adequately account for the challenges and needs associated with travel to work. And this leads into my second key finding, which has to do with the critical role of informal supports to make work mobility possible. And my analysis, through my interviews and document analysis, it became apparent that informal supports play a critical role in the work mobility of people with disabilities. Systems, number one, expect family support or informal supports to help people with disabilities travel to work. And the workers also rely on family support. And I have family in quotation marks because the notion of family is quite broad in this sense. It's not just one's immediate or nuclear family. Family can be quite broadly defined and include friends and coworkers and so on. Any number of people who are brought into the workers' circle of support to facilitate that travel to work. So in terms of the system's expectations of informal supports, you can see that certainly within the workers' compensation system, I've heard from key informants who said that there was an expectation that an injured worker's spouse or family member would take up the work of getting them to their work. And this key informant says, for labor market retraining, like for retraining and for medical appointments for a while, they just hated giving out things like taxi chits and taxi payments. So I had these fights with the case manager who was like, he's the breadwinner, his wife should drive him, what's the problem? Because they didn't want to pay taxis and they wanted his wife to change her shifts to take him to his training. And this key informant notes, it's not like, you know, they're giving this transportation support. Like if an injured worker can't make it there, say, they're a one-car household, we see it all the time. The wife goes off with the car and the husband's home and he can't get to his physio, but we have to fight for that support. Like this should be a given. You can also see in terms of the supports and programs for persons with disabilities that there's an expectation of relying on informal supports. So the Health and Community Services Program with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, explicitly says that home support services, which include the provision of personal and behavioral supports, household management, and respite at the minimum level to maintain individual independence, is a support service that's intended to supplement, not replace, the service provided by the individual family and or the support network. And certainly that's felt by the persons with disabilities. As this person notes, the social worker is like, do you have any informal supports? Who can help you? They use that to reduce your home support hours. So you got to be like, I got nobody at all. They'll ask about my biological family, and they'll turn to my roommate who I just met. They'll turn to my coworker. They were like, ask your boss at work to help you put your splint on. And I was like, you can't ask your boss to help you put your orthotic on. And when the social worker comes, you got to take down all your pictures. If you have a great aunt that you see once a year, they'll suggest her. And I was like, my great aunt doesn't want to help me. It was also evident through my interviews in particular that there is a great reliance on family supports on the part of workers so that they can undertake work-related mobility. And so this person with a disability describes the van and its importance in her ability to get to and from work. And she says, with my van, everything is fine. Previous to that, I was using the early accessible transit program. And at that time, there was no accessible motor bus or accessible cabs. So there were a lot of challenges then. But having my own van opens up so much more. And when I asked how she came to get her van, she notes, I found out about the government grant that would cover up to $25,000 of modifying a vehicle. And my dad at the time had a van because this is how I would get home. He had a van, so he had manual ramps, and he'd come to town, he'd pick me up. So when I found out about this grant, I approached Dad and I asked, if we were to get this grant, would you give me your van? And he said, of course. So I got the grant and he gave me his van and we got it modified. It was a couple of $1,000s more than the grant, which we had to cover off, but we already had the van. So again, it's the reliance on the family supports and family resources, such as this van belonging to her father, in order to be able to undertake reliable transportation to work. And then finally, this person with a disability notes, again, her reliance on family support, again, broadly defined. As she says, like me and my current supervisor, I've known her for 2 years. And I try to think about the moment when we became really close. And I can't think of any because it just happened so quickly. One moment I knew her and was volunteering with her, and the next moment I was employed. And after that, we were going to the farmer's market. I guess when you got a disability, you get good at networking because if there's people who can help you survive. So to conclude then, the findings from the qualitative study, the interviews and data analysis really echoed the findings from the scoping review, which is that work mobility, the accomplishment of that travel to work is largely taken for granted in the research, as well as in the work disability policies and programs. Transportation to work is still largely considered a personal responsibility that is to be taken up and managed by the worker themselves. As I've demonstrated, work disability policies and supports may overlook the work mobility needs and challenges. And finally, to pick up some of that slack, then family can play a really critical role in the work mobility of persons with disabilities. And just some more concluding thoughts, I suppose, around, what's next. And my sense is that we continue to work to develop and foster understanding of really what it takes for workers with mobility impairments to get to work. And as one key informant referred to this as the empathy gap. So really having a full understanding of all that goes into a worker's trip to work and the effort and resources that go into that. We also want to develop understanding of how these workers can be better supported through supported commutes and scheduling accommodations, how transportation and related supports complement or conflict with one another, and the worker's circumstances and available informal supports. And finally, we want to develop and foster understanding of transportation to work as a necessary part of doing one's work. So before I completely conclude, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the co-supervisors of my postdoctoral work, Barbara Neese at Safety Net at Memorial University and Catherine Lapel at the University of Ottawa, as well as the health sciences librarian, Kristen Rahm, who assisted with the scoping review, and of course, the very important funding I received from the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. Thank you.
Ina, thanks so much for your presentation. The Q&A box has been pretty active, so we've got a bunch of questions for you. But our first question for you comes from Sally Kimpson. It's actually a question and then a few comments. I'll ask you the question first, and then I'll go over the comments after. Sally says, "Hi Dana, Sally Kimpson here. A couple of questions or comments re results of scoping review. One of the consequences you noted of under or unemployment was chronic disability. Could you please clarify this descriptor?"
It's really, that was pertaining to work-related injury, and it's a very well documented sort of consequence for injured workers, particularly those engaging with the workers' compensation system and who have problematic experiences, which is what I spent my doctoral work looking at, that can be associated with chronic injury. So injury that that they don't recover from, that becomes prolonged, well beyond the expectations.
Thank you. So the next part of Sally's question were more comments that she mentioned. Those are also from my work. I know that the percentage of people receiving disability benefits doesn't reflect those who have been denied benefits and are likely receiving welfare benefits. As you know from your doctoral work, accessing benefits is a daunting, onerous process. And then Sally had one more comment saying, "And thank you for this informative presentation. A significant factor impeding labor engagement are return to work policies, including earning limits for clawback, embedded in disability income support programs." So Dana, let me know if you have any responses to those comments.
Let's see, I should have been jotting down notes around that. Yes, certainly, applying for supports is an incredibly complicated and daunting process. And what I heard from the persons with disabilities, as well as injured workers, is that policy is very unclear, and what the policy states doesn't necessarily reflect the decision that is made. And oftentimes they find that their eligibility or whether or not they will receive a support is decided on a case-by-case basis. And oftentimes they'll receive one result. For example, in the case of injured workers, they will receive a result from their case manager, which they're dissatisfied with. But once they take it to tribunal, that may be reconsidered. So oftentimes they have to take that extra step to get the supports, and income supports that they feel are fair. Can you remind me of the final comment regarding the return to work policies?
Yeah, the final comment was, "A significant factor impeding labor engagement are return to work policies, including earning limits before clawback embedded in disability income support programs."
For sure, and I think I touched on that a little bit in one of the quotes, right? So, if someone takes up work and they begin earning a certain amount, then the supports that they've been, let's say, enjoying can get clawed back. And so one of the people with disabilities I interviewed reflected on how difficult it is as someone with a disability to get a well-paying job to begin with. She finds herself somewhat stuck in the entry-level type position, how difficult it is to make the salary required at that level to comfortably pay for the various supports. So there is a compromise to be struck where you're working enough, but not so much as to lose the important supports that would cost too much really to pay for on your own.
And our next question comes from Laura Lasansky. Laura said, "Do you think COVID will cause a rethink of work, where it is and how it's done? As a union rep, I experience anxious employers who want, in quotes, normalcy at some point. Ongoing accommodation usually means malingering to them. Having transportation issues means you're not getting back to work normally. Working in a box mentality is bad for all workers, as well as those with disabilities. We have to unpack what is normal in order to change thinking and adapting practices."
It's so true. I'm really hopeful that, the changes that we've seen through COVID-19 will, I think, turn how we think about productivity and what it means to work normally on its head. And I think that's really possible. I had this conversation with one of the people with disabilities that I interviewed, and some of these sort of upsides to COVID-19 for people with disability. So and they noted that while it has introduced challenges around complications of getting to see medical professionals, for example, it's actually really kind of made life far easier in many ways. And one of those ways, of course, is the ability to work from home. And reflecting on having been told for years that you cannot work from home, and now we're in a time where we're proving that we can. And hopefully, the employers that have always perceived or associated work from home with malingering are now seeing through the last 6 months that people can remain productive. And one doesn't have to work 7.5 hours consecutively to complete their job in many cases. They can do it at a time when they're feeling well or productive or alert, and those sorts of things, which are things that people with disabilities can sometimes, all of us, but in particular, as one of my interview respondents noted, it can be difficult to put in that 7.5 to 8 hour day all at once. So COVID-19 has introduced some really nice new ways of doing things.
Thank you. And our next question is more of an administrative one, so I'll answer it. It's from Scott Wilson. He said, excellent presentation. Will a copy of it be available online or by email? So Scott, and to anyone else listening or participating, if you go to the CRWDP website, there is a webinars page. All of our previous webinars are available there, and Dana's will also be available sometime shortly after this presentation today. Our next question comes
I'll just jump in there real quickly, Dan, and just to sort of say that I'm preparing a report as well as a postdoctoral fellow of CRWDP. I'm preparing a report that will really flesh some of this stuff out in more detail. For the presentation today, I really tried to sort of zero in on some of the content that I was really comfortable with and that I thought would be compelling. But certainly, if this has piqued your interest, keep an eye for that report when it goes up over the next month or so. And that will include a lot more detail of all of the complexities involved in this particular issue.
Great, yeah, I have a feeling you might be receiving some emails now about when that report is coming out and how people can access it. So our next question is from Kathy. Kathy says, thank you, Dana, for the great presentation. I cannot agree more with your conclusions that work-related travel has always been taken for granted and hasn't been explored enough in research literature or addressed by support systems. Your research provides insight into this important issue. I never understood the difference between working from home and telework. Could you briefly describe what the difference is?
My understanding is that they are more or less the same, but I haven't, really examined telework very closely. So if there's somebody else on the call who wants to correct me on that, that's my understanding, is that they are set up with the various things they need to work at home, and do it that way, using, of course, all the various technology that we have available to us today, teleconferencing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I personally don't know more of the details there, so I think your answer did it better than I could do with that response. So there might be a follow-up conversation to be had. And our next question comes from Catherine Lapel. Catherine says, telework involves, so I think Catherine perhaps is responding to us here.
Terrific.
Telework involves use of technology, whereas working from home is broader and includes, for instance, sewing at home.
Okay.
Great, well, thank you, Catherine. And we'll see here, our next question comes from Gerald Landry. So Gerald said, Ontario WCB has bought vans for clients in the serious injury program. Then stated Alberta WCB also buys vans and would like to use it for 10 years. If the mileage is too high, they will replace it. And then the last point here, which is the question, reads, Dana, are you aware of WSIB buying vans for serious injury clients in recent years?
No, that's not something I had come across, I'm afraid. So the the quote that I included was from somebody from Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's great to hear, and it's something I missed in my analysis. So thank you for pointing that out.
Great. And our last question for the day is from Barbara Nice. Barbara stated, you were interested in mobility within work as well as mobility to work. Do you have any key findings on mobility within work and work disability policy for the physically disabled?
Mobility within work. I'm just reflecting now on some of the interviews I did with persons with disability, and commenting that they felt they couldn't do particular kinds of jobs because those jobs required, mobility in the course of the work. So they sort of excluded themselves from that particular career path, recognizing that it would be difficult to visit people in their homes, for example, given their accessibility and transportation needs. And they also noted that in some cases they felt they were capable of doing the work, but were not hired because the employer was seeking somebody who had a driver's license, and this was to do sort of fundraising work. And the person with the disability felt that they could achieve that mobility within the course of work using the supports they had available to them, such as accessible transportation and so on. But that was not perceived by the employer as sufficient mobility on the part of the employee to hire them to get that work done.
Thank you. So from here, we'll close off the webinar if that's okay. Dana, do you have any last comments that you might want to make before I just kind of comment on what the next webinars will be?
No, I don't think so. Thank you very much for attending and for your questions and comments. And if anyone has lingering questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out by the email address I've provided here on the screen.
Great. Yeah, well, Dana, thanks so much for your really informative presentation. Our next webinar is going to be October 21st, so please tune in for that as well. If you are interested in the future webinars, there are lots of ways to find out about them. Primarily, if you go to the CRWDP website, you'll find information there, but always feel free to send us an email as well. So yeah, thank you to all of our participants, and to Dana and to Kathy Padkapayeva and Sabrina Imam, who make all of this possible, and everyone have a great day. Bye-bye.